All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're uncovering why the sheer logistical nightmares of early human trade literally forced us to invent money. You know, we take our modern financial systems totally for granted, but getting here, well, that journey was paved with rotting fish, incredibly heavy sacks of grain, and some seriously frustrating negotiations. Just imagine, for a second, a reality completely stripped of all our modern financial conveniences. No coins jingling in your pocket, no bank balance to quickly check on your phone, no credit cards, and absolutely no mobile payment apps. You can't just walk up to a vendor and say, "Hey, this costs $10. By stripping all that away, we're plunging straight back into the harsh necessity of direct exchange. If you need something to survive, you've got to go out, physically track down a person who has it, and then somehow convince them to hand it over to you.
To really understand this world, we need to set our baseline, and that is the barter system. In this setup, value moves directly from one person to another. No middleman, no currency. Think about a farmer handing over a fresh batch of grain to a potter, getting a few clay vessels in return. Or a weaver trading cloth for a jug of milk. There are no accounts being credited, no banks tracking the transaction. It's just purely one good for another good, one service for another service.
Which brings us to part one, a world without prices. Let's explore exactly how these early, small communities functioned before societal scale stepped in and created absolute chaos. Because initially, this system actually made a ton of sense for how our ancestors lived.
In those close-knit villages, direct exchange was actually a massive step forward from just basic survival. People knew each other. They knew exactly who grew the best grain, who shaped the sturdiest pots, and who always caught the biggest fish. Trust was deeply personal here, and community memory, well, that was your ultimate ledger. If you traded some shoddy goods, your neighbors definitely remembered, and you'd be totally out of luck the next time around. But crucially, barter allowed people to specialize. A fisherman didn't have to waste time weaving his own cloth. He could just focus on what he did best and trade his surplus.
But as society started to grow, a massive limitation popped up. Part 2, the double coincidence of wants. This right here is a serious weakness, a concept that completely bottlenecked human progress for a long time.
The frustrating reality of this early trade usually meant you had to navigate an exhausting chain of exchanges. So picture this. A farmer has a bunch of grain, and he desperately needs a new pair of shoes. He goes up to the shoemaker, but the shoemaker's like, "Look, I don't need grain today, I really need milk." Now, the farmer's grain is super useful, sure, but it holds zero value for the shoemaker at that exact moment. So what happens? The farmer literally has to go on a quest. He's got to find a milk producer who happens to want grain, trade the grain for that milk, and then finally lug that milk all the way back to the shoemaker just to get his shoes. It's exhausting just thinking about it.
This total nightmare scenario is what economists call the double coincidence of wants. The crucial takeaway here is that if even one of these super strict conditions failed, the whole exchange just collapsed. Both people absolutely must want exactly what the other person has, at the exact same moment in time, in the exact right quantity, and at an acceptable quality. The sheer statistical improbability of lining all those elements up perfectly, it made early trade so slow, so uncertain, and honestly, just incredibly exhausting.
Because finding the right trade partner was really only half the battle. That brings us to part 3, measuring and dividing value. This created an absolutely overwhelming calculation problem for our ancestors. Think about it. Without a common unit of measure, negotiating every single trade required an intense mental load. Honestly, how many fish equal one clay pot? How much hard labor equals a single basket of salt? Every single trade had to be negotiated completely from scratch. And, complicating matters even more, value wasn't static. A basket of fresh fish might buy a lot in the crisp morning air, but its value completely plummeted by the evening when it started to smell. Or a sack of grain. That became unimaginably precious during a sudden drought. Without a common unit to anchor these values, the market was just this chaotic web of shifting estimates. And then we run headfirst into the sheer absurdity of divisibility. Let's say you just want a tiny amount of salt, or maybe just a single clay pot, but the only thing you have to trade is an entire cow or a whole goat. You simply cannot make a small transaction using half of a living animal. Half a clay pot is just a pile of broken shards, and half a living goat is, well, it's definitely not a living goat anymore, which makes for a pretty terrible trade. This made small, everyday transactions incredibly rigid and unbelievably difficult to pull off.
And the headaches definitely didn't stop at the negotiation table. Part 4, storage and portability traps. These physical limitations severely trapped early traders and completely locked up their hard-earned value.
Traders face just a sheer volume of logistical traps. So imagine you're this highly skilled fisherman. You've had a phenomenal day out on the water, and you've got this massive surplus of fish. Now that surplus represents your hard work. It's your wealth. But if you can't find a trading partner quickly, that wealth literally rots away. Your stored value is completely destroyed by time. You couldn't just save up your surplus for a rainy day because milk turns sour and meat decays. A functioning economy absolutely requires people to preserve value for the future. And barter? Well, it completely failed on this front.
And here is where the whole system truly hits a brick wall. Look, barter was totally fine when you were only trading with your immediate neighbors. But civilization refused to stay small. As little villages evolved into bustling towns and eventually expansive cities, trade routes stretched across vast distances. You couldn't practically drag heavy sacks of grain, herd a bunch of unruly cattle, or carefully carry fragile clay pots hundreds of miles just to hope you might find someone who wanted them. Under the massive weight of distance and scale, direct exchange became way too heavy and entirely unpredictable.
Aside from the literal physical weight of it all, we hit part 5, the problem with future promises, and the severe limits this placed on credit. This was just a massive hurdle for human economic growth.
Consider this super practical question. A farmer needs to borrow seeds right now, right before the harvest, and promises to pay his neighbor back later. But how do you write that contract without money? Do you repay them in grain? Maybe in labor? What happens to that debt if a drought completely wipes out the harvest, or if the value of grain completely flips over the season? Without a common unit of account, defining future obligations was nearly impossible, and that kept credit, and thereby all economic growth, completely stunted.
All these compounding frictions, the rotting fish, the undividable goats, the totally impossible debt contracts, they forced a major turning point. Section 6, the bridge to money. We just had to find a better way.
Humanity desperately searched for commonly accepted items that could solve these physical and mental traps. They were looking for things that were easier to carry, easier to divide, and, crucially, wouldn't rot in a week. So things like salt, rare shells, and eventually metals began to emerge. These items became the early stepping stones toward actual currency, serving as a medium that pretty much everyone in the market generally recognized as valuable.
And this brings us to the ultimate psychological turning point of human economics. The true breakthrough here was collective belief. People began accepting certain items not only because they needed them directly, but because they believed, they trusted that others would accept them later. A person might accept a rare shell for their grain, not because they wanted to eat the shell or make a fancy necklace out of it, but because they had absolute faith that a shoemaker would accept that exact same shell tomorrow. This shared belief shifted society away from face-to-face direct exchange, and it created a powerful, abstract bridge straight to the concept of money.
So the barter system wasn't just some primitive failure. It was actually the essential classroom where humanity learned that labor, goods, and trust inherently hold value. But it also proved that direct exchange was fundamentally incompatible with a growing, complex society. I'll leave you to ponder this incredible leap in human history. What happens when the literal physical exhaustion of trading goods transforms into the frictionless exchange of shared symbols? The failure of the barter system didn't just force us to invent money. It quite literally gave birth to the foundational mechanics of the modern world as we know it.